Chapter 2 Rereading the Symptomatic Reading Robert J. C. Young. If we read its opening page in the original French, our first understanding of the meaning of the title Lire capital is that it takes the form of an injunction. Althusser is telling us that instead of understanding Marx through the prism of secondary accounts of his work, we should return to the original text and read Marx in his own words, unmediated by the many political and academic commentaries, paraphrases, and interpretations of his work that have proliferated since Capital was first published in 1867, a move that corresponds in a recognizable way to the general return to of the 1960s, the rereading of original texts initiated by Jacques Lacan a decade earlier with respect to Freud. 1 The problem is that in some sense we already read Capital all around us, says Althusser, that is, to the degree that the book is visible in the disputes, conflicts, defeats, and victories of everyday history. So too, we read Capital in the writings of the dead and the living, in Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Gramsci, and so on, in the many fragments from Capital that are quoted and selected for us, as well as in the many popular paraphrases and introductions to Marx that have always proliferated and which continue to introduce or explain Capital to us right up to today. The book is at once overread and yet remains unread. But someday, Althusser famously adds at this point, it is essential to read Capital to the letter. To read the text complete, all 4 volumes, line by line. What might it mean, though, to read Capital to the letter? Or to read the text complete? A literal reading, painfully scrupulous, word by word, a slow, plodding, complete, exact reading that omits nothing. A vast undertaking. Althusser has already given us this message in the epigraph to the book, the prominently displayed letter from Marx to Maurice Lacatre, his French publisher, of March 18, 1872, where Marx endorses the idea of making Capital more accessible to the workers by publishing it in serial form, warning that the reading of the first chapters is rather arduous, but strictly necessary, because there is no royal road to science. Only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. RCC 9. 3. Reading Capital must be like an exhausting climb up a mountain, and only that laborious, almost Sisyphean method will deliver the sublimity of its enlightenment. We must read it to the letter, read the precise words that were written by Marx and which he left for us. What though, in Althusser's case, can it mean to insist on reading Capital to the letter when he is reading a translation? The continued use of Roy's translation as the standard popular text of Capital for French readers, despite the publication in 1983 of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre's translation of the 4th German edition, means that in general the French used to read, and in fact generally still read, what is quite literally a different book from the one that everyone else reads, which raises the interesting question, does it make a difference? In Althusser's case, does he only read Marx, as it were, to the French letter? How can we read a translation to the letter given the absence, precisely, of the letters, the signifiers, of the original? Not entirely, Althusser himself admits, and it is essential to read Capital not only in its French translation, even Volume 1 in Roy's translation, which Marx revised, or rather, rewrote, but also in the German original, at least for the fundamental theoretical chapters and all the passages where Marx's key concepts come to the surface. A Forent, RCC 11. We must not only read Capital to the letter in translation in French therefore but also the German original, though only selectively, that is, just the fundamental theoretical chapters and all the passages where Marx's key concepts come to the surface. We must read across to the German original only where the key concepts become visible like rocks, outcrops on the surface of the soil, emerging from the depths of the text, a metaphor that seems to contradict the initial emphasis on surface. But then what exactly is this original when, as Althusser himself remarks, Marx himself not only supervised the French translation but also revised, or rather rewrote the original in doing so, effectively layering even the surface of the text. The French translation of Capital by Joseph Roy, which appeared in serial form from 1870–75, was based on a copy of the first 1867 edition, corrected in manuscript by Marx up to page 280, and was the last printed version that Marx himself supervised. 5. The second German edition, of 1873, contained fewer revisions than the French. The third German edition, edited by Engels, which appeared in 1883, was based on the 1873 edition, with some changes from the French text. Finally, the fourth, supposedly definitive edition, of 1890 was issued by Engels and more fully, but not totally, incorporated some of the changes of the French edition. This complex textual history only covers Volume 1. Since the publication of the full German mega edition of Marx's works from 1972 onward, the textual complexity of Capital has become far more serious. 6. The Capital and Preparatory Manuscripts section in the mega edition amount to 23 separate volumes. From this scrupulous editorial work, it has become clear that, as Michael Heinrich puts it, Engels combined manuscripts, which were taken out of different drafts, written at different times. Furthermore, Engels altered considerably the original manuscripts of Marx. 7. The editors of the mega edition destroyed any remaining idea of Capital as a complete, single work, while arguing decisively that the so-called Book 4 was in fact always an entirely separate book. It showed that in terms of planning, there were two distinct projects that make up the manuscripts now associated with Capital, and that these two projects exist in at least 2 and 3 drafts respectively. 8. Capital exists in an almost undecipherable palimpsest of different books and drafts of different versions in 2 languages, all of which are in different ways the originals. 9. This means that reading Capital to the letter becomes a very different operation than it would be for a straightforward single text. We can read the originals, but if we are to speak of them, then the long-standing impulse toward commentary on Capital can hardly be avoided, commentary that, as Foucault puts it, paradoxically, in order to say what the author said, must say what the author never actually said. In order to say what is there, you must see what is not there. 10. Althusser of course knew something of this textual complexity, aside from the different published editions, the Grundrisse, as well as the manuscript on surplus value, the so-called Capital Book 4, were already published by 1965, even if he necessarily remained unaware of the vast depths of the forest of manuscripts that have more recently been made available. But even if the text of Capital can now be seen to be a good deal more complex than Althusser ever envisaged, he was nevertheless already responding to something of the labyrinthine multilingual condition of Capital and suggesting that it must be read in 2 languages, also in the German original, at least for the fundamental theoretical chapters. Even before the baggy monster of the various published versions and thousands of pages of manuscript were published, it was already obvious that there was no single version of the book, let alone an authoritative one in which it could be claimed that there Marx achieved a clean-cut epistemological break between the humanist and scientific. Rather, it was precisely because of the unfinished nature of Capital that Althusser sought to identify the break through his particular reading of the text. That textual complexity provides the basis, in fact, for the major claim that Althusser proceeds to make, namely that if we read Capital literally, to the letter, we discover that it contains its own, new theory of reading. When we read Marx, we immediately find a reader who reads to us, and out loud, RCC 16. In order to try to reconstruct the complexity of Althusser's theoretical intervention here, I shall here follow his own method, namely not attempt an overview of the subsequent reception of, and commentaries on, the work, beginning with his own collaborators, Balibar, Machuret, and Rancière, nor even of his contributions to this particular book, nor even, on this occasion, consider the specific historical conjuncture in which this intervention was made, but returned to the letter of the original in order to reread his own contributions so as to reconstruct and establish the force of his theoretical, translational intervention. In short, I shall be reading Althusser's contribution to reading capital to the letter. We generally use the phrase, to the letter, less for reading than for following instructions, but I followed your instructions to the letter. Or for fastidiously obeying rules, his orders were carried out to the letter. And this in fact is how Althusser does read Marx, for it turns out that for Althusser to read Marx to the letter is to follow a rule, in this case a rule of reading. In its own day, Literary Capital became famous as much for its account of a new methodology of reading as for its reinterpretation of Marx's Capital. For many in the humanities and social sciences, reading was, and is, an innocent activity, simply something that you learn how to do, like riding a bike, after which you do not have to think about. Althusser's idea was startling, not just that we should read the text of Capital itself, rather than its summaries, paraphrases, and commentaries, but that we should also recognize that it provides a method of reading, a method through which Marx dictates his philosophy to Althusser from beyond the grave. Reading Marx to the letter produces the discovery of a second kind of reading practiced by Marx himself, a method which Althusser will call symptomatic. Althusser discovers this in Marx's own reading of the classical economists, in a passage from Capital which he cites at length, from the Roy translation, presented here, in turn, in Brewster's English translation. In this way, classical political economy believed it had ascended from the accidental prices of labor to the real value of labor. It then determined this value by the value of the subsistence good necessary for the maintenance and reproduction of the laborer. It thus unwittingly changed terrain, a sun in su, L change it on seated terrain, italics in original, by substituting for the value of labor, up to this point, the apparent object of its investigations, the value of labor power, a power which only exists in the personality of the laborer, and is as different from the function, labor, as a machine is from its performance. The result the analysis led to, therefore, was not a resolution of the problem as it emerged at the beginning, but a complete change in the terms of that problem. Classical economy never arrived at an awareness of this substitution. L'économie classique n'y parvint jamais à se percevoir de ce quid pro quo, italics in original. 11 There is an interesting difference here between the French translation which Althusser cites, and the later German original of the fourth edition. As we shall see, without mentioning it explicitly, Althusser seems to draw on both versions. Here a sun in su means unknown to them, without their knowledge here nicely translated in English as unwittingly, while the French quid pro quo here translated as substitution has a meaning slightly different from its English usage, where it carries the idea of giving something in return, as compensation, scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. The French usage is closer to the original Latin meaning, referring to a misunderstanding or a mistake, taking one thing for another. But in Althusser's French there is not just awareness of this but direct perception, se percevoir, to perceive something, to become aware or conscious of something. From this Althusser therefore defines Marx's insights as that of the classical political economists not seeing something, not being aware of it, and what they don't see, paradoxically, is what they see. I take this astonishing text for what it is, a protocol of Marx's reading of classical economics. What classical political economy does not see, is not what it does not see, it is what it sees. It is not what it lacks, on the contrary, it is what it does not lack. It is not what it misses, on the contrary, it is what it does not miss. C'est qu'économie politique classique n'y voit pas, ce n'est pas ce qu'elle n'y voit pas, qu'est-ce qu'elle voit, ce n'est pas ce qu'il lui manque, c'est au contraire ce qui ne lui manque pas, ce n'est pas ce qu'elle rate, c'est au contraire ce qu'elle n'y rate pas. RCC 19, Rereading the text, Althusser argues that classical political economy has produced a correct answer. But what catches Marx's eye is a remarkable property of this answer, namely that it is the correct answer to a question that has just one failing: it was never posed. 20. It is rather Marx who produces the original question from the answer, which effects a complete change in the terms of the problem. What Althusser will first call the symptomatic reading, therefore, involves identifying the paradox of an answer which does not correspond to any question posed. 12. What political economy does not see is what it does, its production of a new answer without its question, and simultaneously the production of a new latent question resting invisible in the gap between the unasked question and the new answer. Through the lacunary terms of its answer, political economy has produced a new question, but unwittingly. It made a complete change in the terms of the original problem, and thereby produced a new problem, without knowing it. It remained convinced that it was still on the terrain of the old problem, whereas it had unwittingly changed terrain. Its blindness and its oversight, bavure, blunder, mistake, slip, lie in this misunderstanding, quid pro quo, between what it produces and what it sees, in this substitution, which Marx elsewhere calls a play on words, Wortspiel, that is necessarily impenetrable for its author. 23. The symptomatic reading that Althusser finds in Marx, that seeks the unstated question for the offered answer, therefore involves not interpretation but the production of new knowledge from a reading that identifies an invisible gap in the text. This is the version of the symptomatic reading that Etienne Balibar pursues in his own essay in Reading Capital. In reality, says Balibar, this preface to a contribution, if it is read attentively, does not present us with the form of a hypothesis, but explicitly that of an answer to a question we must try to reconstitute. RCC 360. To read to the letter is to find that the letter appears to be missing, not in place. Startling though this idea is, the symptomatic reading also draws on other, more Freudian resonances that shift it from Althusser's initial question-answer formulation. The insight of Marx's astonishing reading that Althusser emphasizes is to spot the blindness of the slip, which Marx at other times calls a play on words or pun, Wortspiel, but here a quid pro quo which, literally in fact describes a slip of the pen, for quid pro quo originally designated a scroll mistake of substituting the nominative qui for an ablative, quo, qui pro quo. At one level, Althusser here seems to be moving Marx's reading toward an anticipation of a deconstructive reading, of blindness and insight, while at another, the obvious resonance is that of Freud's wordplays, puns, slips of the tongue. The Freudian echo, despite the removal of one paragraph in the second edition, noted by Warren Montag, 13, remains strong with the topographic imagery of surfaces and depths, of puns and wordplay, of doing things unwittingly. Althusser did not make this connection unknowingly either, as he would have noticed, the Freudian resonance is even stronger in the original, later, German, where in the fourth edition Marx explicitly uses the word Bewusstlos, unconscious, and die Bewusstlosigkeit, unconsciousness. In Ben Fowlkes's 1976 English translation, the political economists unconsciously, Bewusstlos, substituted this question for the original one, for the search after the cost of production of labor as such turned in a circle, and did not allow them to get any further at all. Classical political economy's unconsciousness, die Bewusstlosigkeit, of this result of its own analysis and its uncritical acceptance of the category's value of labor, etc., led it into inextricable confusions and contradictions, as will be seen later. Note a reference forward to the projected Volume 4, known now as Theories of Surplus Value. 14. In making this connection with Freud at the invitation of Marx's own text, Althusser himself at times moves toward what one might call a more recognizably Lacanian account of the symptomatic reading, where the reader looks for gaps, fissures, unconscious moments of the unsaid in the text. At the same time, I suggested that we had to submit Marx's text not to an immediate reading, but to a symptomatic reading, In order to discern in the apparent continuity of the discourse the lacunae, blanks and failures of rigor, the places where Marx's discourse is merely the unsaid of his silence, RCC 294. Arguably this formulation, of the kind subsequently developed by Pierre Macherey, is rather less radical than Althusser's original observation that it is not what it lacks, it is what it does not lack. The letter is not missing, it is rather in place but cannot be seen. It is not that it is not there, lacking, but that it is not there. This symptomatic reading, which Althusser points to as a sign or symptom of the degree to which the epistemological break was never clean, has led to descriptions of the kind we find in Jacques Rancière, where Althusser's project is equated with Freud's and Lacan's as a search for those unsuccessful, i.e. inadequate, modes of expression that exemplify such symptomatic procedures of misrecognition. 15. There is clearly Lacanian component at work here, for what is distinctive about Lacan, says Althusser, is that he takes Freud's words literally. 16. For Lacan the unconscious, like the purloined letter, is always there, visible, but not seen, like the large letters of names from mountain ranges that spread in a different scale from everything else across the map. So Althusser emphasizes that the classical political economists rather see something without knowing it. What classical political economy does not see, is not what it does not see, it is what it sees. That is why the letter, as Lacan puts it, insists. However, this paradoxical statement, what classical political economy does not see, is what it sees, suggests something more complex. At its most radical, Althusser's model conforms neither to the Freudian, Lacanian model of identifying what is repressed or visibly invisible to provide an interpretation of such a symptom that explains its meaning, nor to the Derridean model in which a text's mistakes, bavures, enable its deconstruction into mutually incompatible contradictory arguments or narratives, a maneuver that is satisfying to perform but ends typically at a state of impasse. Althusser's model is more challenging, since for him reading involves the production of new knowledge from the text, something that is there but not there, defined, visible, but excluded. The heart of the symptomatic reading is the idea that reading is always a double reading, what, following Rancière, we might call a poetics, a making, or a remaking. When reading moves from single to double, and becomes symptomatic, it moves from innocence, they do not see what they see, to experience and guilt. It is, we might say, traduizable in the sense of traduizable and justice, liable to prosecution, to be sued. Just as the symptom implies a fall, Latin symptoma, from Greek sigma mu pi tau omega mu alpha, chance, accident, mischance, disease, sigma upsilon nu pi pi tau epsilon iota nu, to fall together, fall upon. So in order to move from the readings of economists, historians, or logicians, which Althusser characterizes as innocent, the philosophical reading must become guilty. Hence a philosophical reading of capital is quite the opposite of an innocent reading. It is a guilty reading, but not one that absolves its crime on confessing it. On the contrary, it takes the responsibility for its crime as a justified crime and defends it by proving its necessity. It is therefore a special reading which exculpates itself as a reading by posing every guilty reading the very question that unmasks its innocence, the mere question of its innocence. What is it to read? RCC 13. The philosophical reading that distinguishes capital's place in the history of knowledge is guilty, coupable. Guilty perhaps insofar as its epistemological question repeats capital's own crime of undoing the ideology of capitalism and detecting the real object through which it is constituted. But why crime, exactly, or guilt? Because it is not innocent, and produces knowledge. The new knowledge of our age, Althusser claims, will be marked by the most difficult trial of all, that is, the discovery of and training in the meaning of the simplest acts of existence, seeing, listening, speaking, reading, RCC 13. Althusser ascribes this constitutive knowledge to the interventions of Marx, Nietzsche and Freud. Tantalizingly but characteristically, he says nothing about Nietzsche, and goes straight to Freud. Only since Freud have we begun to suspect what listening, and hence what speaking, and keeping silent, means. Vo dire, that this meaning, vu lawyer dire, of speaking and listening reveals beneath the innocence of speech and hearing the culpable depth of a second, quite different discourse, the discourse of the unconscious. RCC 14. Althusser reads Freud too in terms of innocence and guilt. The Freudian reading is the guilty reading because it exposes what should have remained hidden. In Marx, for example, to whom Althusser immediately returns after this single sentence. It is at this point that we see that the philosophical reading is indeed still being modeled to some degree on a Freudian depth, surface model, of the innocent surface and the culpable depth, and recall Althusser's claim that for his philosophical reading it is necessary to read the German original, at least for the fundamental theoretical chapters and all the passages where Marx's key concepts come to the surface. 11. In distancing himself from an innocent, or as he also puts it a transparent reading, Althusser moves not just back to Freud but more predictably to Spinoza, the man who linked together the essence of reading and the essence of history in a theory of the difference between the imaginary and the true. RCC 14. A distinction which is identified both with those of the innocent and the guilty, and the historical distinction between ideology and science. 15. Spinoza, Althusser argues, undid the religious myth of reading, of the pre-fallen world in which the world is read as the language of God. As Walter Benjamin puts it in his essay on language as such and on the language of man, 1916, the whole of nature, too, is imbued with a nameless, unspoken language, the residue of the creative word of God. 17. Marx's Capital by contrast, Althusser argues, recognizes an internal dislocation, décalage, in the real, inscribed in its structure, which allows him to break with reading God's word in nature. Marx interrupts the innocent religious myth of reading, 15, in which each part expresses the whole, to pursue the Promethean quest of understanding that the truth of history cannot be read in its manifest discourse, but, in the inaudible and illegible notation of the effects of a structure of structures. The truth of history is not there on the surface, manifest discourse, but remains hidden by its inaudibility and illegibility. Until Marx it could not be heard or read. Marx's new method of reading therefore is not just another form of reading, an alternative hermeneutic, it is a new kind of reading that breaks with the history of reading for the logos in order to read the text of history in all its precariousness and rupture, to read history in terms of its disjunctive delays, to read a text by recognizing its internal dislocation, décalage. For Althusser, following the method of Marx himself which allows us to recognize the fantastically innovative character of texts that are theoretically in advance of the concepts that were then available. 73. Reading must become double, a form of dislocation, hence duplicitous, enforcing delay, inserting temporality, historicity into the transparent immediacy of conventional reading. Recall his opening remark: we have been able to read, capital, every day, transparently. 11. Articulating the synchronic with diachrony, the visibility of space with the process of time. This kind of reading as rereading, repetition, produces a mutation, a translation and transformation of the text. At this point, consequently, we encounter a spectacular reversal. The literal reading is rejected. A merely literal reading of Marx's text, even an attentive one, will leave us unsatisfied or even make us miss the question altogether. RCC 219. Reading must become differential, doubled up, and take the form of décalage, unwedging, staggering, shifting, of displacement, slippage, difference of phase, become out of step, enforce a time lag, all of which must necessarily prompt a form of double reading. 220. Although Althusser does not acknowledge this, His method of reading is rather different from another that he highlights as an illustration of his own, the account by Engels of Marx's theoretical innovation with respect to the concept of surplus value. Engels describes this as transformative of the whole basis of knowledge in the subject in the same way as the scientific discoveries of Galileo or Lavoisier, a theoretical revolution that achieves a mutation of the problematic, a changing of the theoretical base, by posing as a problem what had been seen as a solution. RCC 305, a labor of theoretical transformation which necessarily affects the object of knowledge. 308. For his part, Althusser asserts himself in a footnote by comparing Marx to Freud instead, an analogy much more problematic than Engels' comparison of Marx to Galileo. But while Engels recognizes the importance of the production of a new concept that transforms the object of knowledge, what Althusser does not emphasize here is that Marx himself did not fully achieve this in Capital in the forms in which he left it, and that it was precisely through the continuous production of new editions, involving editing and rewriting, that Engels himself sought to produce the definitive new concepts from Marx's text. What Althusser recognizes is that in doing so, Engels was applying the same reading method to Capital as Marx himself had applied to the classical political economists, the double reading that generated a rewriting through which the original text was mutated or transformed to bring out the underlying transformative new concept anachronistically concealed within it. The new concepts could only be produced through a continuous process of the rewriting and translation of the original text. The most powerful example of this method is not, however, discussed explicitly in Rereading Capital, but itself appears symptomatically for future readers of the text, flagged shamelessly at the beginning of the volume. Le Cadavre d'Angel placard is entirely visible, just as Lacouture himself put Marx's letter to him at the front of the first French edition, so, as I have already mentioned, Althusser places as epigraph to the book Marx's same letter to Lacouture. This letter about the Roy, Marx translation, that as we have seen Althusser himself uses as the explicit metaphorical structure of his book, The Laborious Journey in the Search for Truth, also provides the visible, invisible model of reading for reading Capital. It's there, but you don't see it. As we saw earlier, Althusser mentions parenthetically that we must read Marx and Roy's translation, which Marx revised, or rather, rewrote. This revision, rewriting by Marx himself of the original German first edition, constitutes the basis of the special authority of the French text. Paradoxically, however, the reason that Marx felt impelled to revise and rewrite the translation was because the translator Roy had made the mistake of reading Capital to the letter, the very procedure that Althusser himself advocates at the beginning of reading Capital. In 1872 Marx wrote to Nikolai Danielson, who had just published the first translation of Capital, into Russian, even though the French edition may be the work of someone quite knowledgeable in the two languages. He, the translator, often translated too literally. I was therefore compelled to edit anew, in French, whole passages which I wanted to make readable. Later it will be all the easier to translate the whole from French into English in the Romance languages. 18 We now know, thanks to the researches of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, that the story was in certain ways more complicated, but Marx's own summary here is that he rewrote the French because the problem of the French translation was that the translator read Capital too much to the letter, as a result of which he felt impelled to rewrite it. Marx's response to his translator's too literal reading was to take things out, and to refashion the book in a less philosophical manner for French readers who are always impatient to come to a conclusion, as Marx puts it. The popularization of Capital for French readers, as Ben Fowkes, the translator of the English Penguin edition, suggests, involved making it more accessible and smoothing over or omitting more complex philosophical passages which Roy had complained French was ill-suited to reproduce, which makes Althusser's use of the French edition in order to read Capital as philosophers, RCC 12, somewhat paradoxical. On the other hand, If Marx took things out, he also put new things in. It was precisely rereading and then rewriting capital in translation that enabled Marx to produce some of the most productive concepts of the book from his own original text. In particular, the sections on accumulation and the fetishism of commodities that have become absolutely pivotal for generations of Marxist theorists. Both these were the products of Marx's reading and rewriting of the French translation of his own German original. So, despite his famous opening announcement about reading to the letter, the result of that is that Althusser comes to reject a merely literal reading of Marx's text in favor of a double reading in which the literal reading is only the first stage, RCC 219. Hidden behind this idea of double reading is a concept of translation. Marx's insight begins with his translation of the political economists answering an unasked question, in translation's literal meaning in English of translation as carrying across. They thus unwittingly change terrain. The reading that Althusser then performs, however, is more akin to the French form of translation, traduire, from traducere, to lead across, induct, draw out, where the reader reads the text across time to draw out and produce a new, but already implicit, reading, the afterlife of its translatability as it were. Although Althusser's own concept of language is faithfully Stalinist, science can no more be ranged within the category superstructure than can language, which as Stalin showed escapes it. RCC 283. His concept of translation is less literal than Marx's. Althusser himself uses the term translation to designate a conceptual elaboration and rewriting similar to that which Marx felt obliged to perform. Every terminology is linked to a definite circle of ideas, and we can translate this, say que nous pouvons traduire, by saying, every terminology is a function of the theoretical system that provides its basis. Every terminology brings with it a determinate and limited theoretical system. RCC 299. The symptomatic reading therefore involves a double process of reading the text to the letter, performing a literal translation, and then, as a result of that reading of the visible, and hinged on the decalage of the time lag between readings, articulating the invisible through a rewriting. Just as Marx rewrote the classical economists, and then rewrote his own text, and then Engels rewrote Marx, so Althusser too reads Marx in order to rewrite him, to produce the visible and visible concepts in Marx in his text, anachronistic concepts that were ahead of the theoretical vocabulary of their time. The symptomatic reading, therefore, is not at all a Freudian reading in which symptoms are traced back to their explanatory cause, but a translation of the text forward into the terms of the new concepts toward which it was working. Althusser in reading capital seeks to retrieve another method of reading that is Marx's own. Just as he would deliberately leave Lyrilla Capital unfinished, as Marx left Capital unfinished, just as he would revise Lyrilla Capital and publish different editions, with added material and some omitted, as Marx did with Capital, so too he will read Marx carefully enough, to the letter, in order to detect and repeat his method of reading and rewrite his text in order to produce, draw out, Marx's own philosophical concepts from the visible and visible in his texts. The symptomatic reading becomes not so much the analyst producing the solution from a reading of the text as in Freud, but reading as a form of stenographic dictatorship, where the remote, disembodied Marx is discovered to be instructing the reader in prescribing, prescribe, to write in advance, to lay down a rule, to dictate 19, a second, more fundamental text that shall be written on his behalf. In this we are absolutely committed to a theoretical destiny. We cannot read Marx's scientific discourse without at the same time writing at his dictation, sous sa propre dictée, my italics, the text of another discourse, inseparable from the first one but distinct from it, the discourse of Marx's philosophy, RCC 297. Notes 1. Althusser himself discusses this phenomenon with respect to Lacan and Husserl. See Louis Althusser, Freud in Lacan, in Lenin and Philosophy, and other essays, trans. Ben Brewster, London, New Left Books, 1971, 185. 2. Louis Althusser, Etienne Balibar, Roger Establet, Pierre Macheret, and Jacques Rancière, Reading Capital, The Complete Edition, trans. Ben Brewster and David Fernbach, London, Verso, 2016, 11. Further page references will be cited in the text, RCC. 3. Althusser, et al., Reading Capital. 4. Karl Marx, Le Capital, Critique de l'économie politique, 4th ed., trans. Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, Paris, Editions Socials, 1983. 5. Karl Marx, Le Capital, trans. M. J. Roy, Paris, Editeurs Maurice Lacouture, 1872-75, Kevin Anderson, The Unknown Marxist Capital Volume 1, the French edition of 1872-75, 100 years later, Review of Radical Political Economics 15, No. 4, 1983. 6. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Gesamtausgabe, Mega/Herausgegeben vom Institut für Marxismus-Leninismus beim Zentralkomitee der Kommunistischen Partei der Sowjetunion und vom Institut für Marxismus-Leninismus beim Zentralkomitee der Sozialistischen Einheitspartei Deutschlands, Berlin, Dietz, 1972. 7. Michael Heinrich, Deconstructing Capital, New Insights from Marx's Economic Manuscripts in Mega, Summary of the Historical Materialism Annual Conference, 2006, New Directions in Marxian Theory, 2. 8. Michael Heinrich, An Introduction to the 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Capital, New York, Monthly Review Press, 2012. 9. C. Among others, Jacques Bidet, Exploring Marx's Capital, Philosophical, Economic, and Political Dimensions, trans. David Fernbach, Leiden, Brill, 2007, and Regina Roth, Karl Marx's Original Manuscripts in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, Mega, Another View on Capital, in Rereading Marx, New Perspectives After the Critical Edition, ed. Riccardo Bellofiore and Roberto Finsci, Basingstoke, UK, Palgrave Macmillan, 2009. 10. Michel Foucault, L'Ordre du Discours, Paris, Gallimard, 1971. 11. RCC, 21-22. Roy's text can be found in Marx and Engels, Gesamtausgabe, Mega, 27.464. 12. The production of a new question differentiates Althusser's symptomatic reading from Freud's, which according to Althusser produced a new object, the unconscious, Freud in Lacan, 184. 13. Warren Montag, Louis Althusser, London, Palgrave, 2003, 82-83. 14. Karl Marx, Capital, 3 volumes, trans. Ben Fowkes and David Fernbach, Harmondsworth, UK, Penguin Books, 1976-81, 1-678-79. 15. Jacques Rancière, Dissenting Words, A Conversation with Jacques Rancière, interview by David Panagia, Diacritics 30, No. 2, 2000, 114. See also Rancière's early critique of Althusser, Lawless and Althusser, Paris, Gallimard, 1974. 16. Althusser, Freud in Lacan, 185, cf. 199, even if they were compared with the letter of Freud's analysis. Althusser's emphasis on reading to the letter was obviously inspired by Lacan's famous essays of 1957. L'instance de la lettre dans l'inconscient ou la raison depuis Freud, and Le séminaire sur la lettre volée, le séminaire de Jacques Lacan, livre 16, D'un auteur à l'autre, 1968-1969, ed. Jacques-Alain Miller, Paris, Editions du Seuil, 2006, 412-43, 6-50. 17. Walter Benjamin, On Language as Such and on the Language of Man, 1916, in Selected Works, 4 volumes, ed. Marcus Bullock and Michael W. Jennings, Cambridge, M.A., Harvard University Press, 1996, 1:74. According to Althusser, this Promethean reading is projected onto nature so as not to perish in the daring project of knowing it. 17. 18. Cited by Anderson, The Unknown Marxist Capital Volume 1, 73. 19. S.V. Prescribe, 2. To Lay Down. Dictate, Merriam-Webster, 1980.